Good evening, and welcome back to Haunted Tales. Tonight, we journey deep into Alaska during the most unsettling season of all, when the sun abandons the land, and months of endless night swallow every road, every home, every soul. In this darkness, shadows are not just shadows. They move, they wait, they feed. What you are about to hear are not campfire stories or whispered legends. These are chilling accounts, documented testimonies from truckers, oil workers, and isolated residents who faced horrors no daylight has ever touched. Out here, survival is not just about warmth or shelter. It is about keeping your sanity intact while something unseen lingers just beyond the glow of your headlights. If this is your first time here, make sure you subscribe to Haunted Tales for nightly journeys into the true and terrifying. And don't forget to ring the notification bell, because in places where the sun never rises, you'll want to know when the darkness calls. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments from where are you watching and what time it is. Now, let us step into the frozen silence of the Alaskan wilderness, where the world ends and terror begins. On the southern edge of Alaska's Kenai Peninsula lies a stretch of wild, unforgiving coastline few dare to approach. The waters are cold, the cliffs rise steep, and thick forests press down to the shore like a wall of shadows. It is here, in a remote cove once called Port Chatham, or Portlock, that a story took root. A story so unsettling that, even now, more than 70 years after the last family fled, the place remains abandoned. Portlock was not always a ghost town. In the early 1900s, it was a small but hard-working settlement. A cannery operated on its shores, pulling thousands of pounds of salmon from the sea each year. Families lived in wooden cabins, children played along the tide pools, and hunters vanished into the tree line in search of game. To any outsider, it seemed like just another Alaskan fishing town, braving the harshness of the frontier. But something was wrong, something that would grow darker with every passing year, until the people of Portlock could no longer endure it. The earliest accounts of trouble reach back to the 1920s. Men would set out into the forest to hunt moose or trap beaver, and never return. At first, this was written off as bad luck. The wilderness is cruel, and the land around Portlock is as unforgiving as any in Alaska. A single misstep on the ridges, an avalanche of snow, or the charge of a bear could take a life in moments. But when search parties combed the woods, they often found something worse than absence. Shredded clothing, pools of blood, bodies torn apart, bones cracked open as though smashed against stone. Death by animal attack was common in Alaska, but those who saw the remains insisted these deaths were different. Something about the brutality, the senseless violence, suggested a killer that was not hunting for food, but for something else entirely. One trapper's journal, recovered decades later, spoke of finding prints too large for a man, but shaped as though one had walked upright. He claimed he felt watched for 3 nights in a row before finally abandoning his lines and fleeing to the village. Among the Alutiiq people, the indigenous inhabitants of the region, there is a name spoken with dread, Aniakchak. Descriptions vary, but all speak of a massive hairy creature, larger than a man, with the strength to rip apart trees. Some compare it to Bigfoot, others whisper it is something far worse, a spirit of vengeance that punishes those who trespass. The elders warned the settlers never to venture too far into the mountains, never to mock the sounds in the night, never to underestimate the eyes watching from the dark. But in Portlock, the warnings were not enough. Villagers began reporting strange cries echoing through the canyons, cries too deep for any known animal, reverberating like thunder. At night, children were kept close to their beds, for the women swore they saw shadows moving between the treetops, enormous forms that lingered just out of sight. And then came the direct encounters. One fisherman told of rowing back late at night, the fog rolling heavy across the cove. As he neared shore, he saw a figure standing on the cliff watching. It was tall, broad-shouldered, its silhouette almost too large to be human. When his lantern light flickered across it, he swore he saw two eyes glinting red. The figure turned and melted into the forest without a sound. Another account, passed down by descendants, described a logger who vanished only yards from camp. His axe was found embedded in a stump, but the man himself had been dragged away, leaving furrows in the moss where his boots had scraped the earth. The trail ended in the undergrowth, swallowed whole by the trees. A chilling story came from a young boy who survived. He recalled playing by the creek with friends when he saw a hairy giant crouching at the water's edge. It looked up, its face dark and wild, before loping silently into the woods. That night, his father vanished on a hunting trip. The boy never forgot the creature's eyes. Like burning coals in a frozen skull, he would later say. What truly broke Portlock was not a single killing, but a series of vanishings so rapid the village fell into despair. Men went missing within sight of the cannery. A group of workers reported seeing a giant dark figure cross the ridge in full daylight. Then came the mutilations, bodies found on the rocky beaches, dismembered in ways no bear could manage. One elderly woman later recalled how the town fell silent after dark. "You could hear your own heart beating," she said. We knew it was out there, waiting. Nobody wanted to be the next to go. By 1949, boats began to leave the harbor for good. Families packed what little they could carry, abandoning homes, nets, and gear. They did not sell their land, did not wait for a proper relocation. They simply fled. By 1951, Portlock was a ghost town. When outsiders asked why, the surviving villagers all gave the same answer. Something in the woods was killing their people. For decades, Portlock stood empty, its cabins rotting and its cannery overtaken by moss. But the stories did not end. Hunters who dared to camp there reported being circled by heavy footsteps at night. Fishermen swore they heard guttural growls carried over the water. One man claimed he saw something enormous moving between the trees, keeping pace with his skiff as he rowed frantically out to sea. Even the military briefly used Portlock as a base for training exercises. Soldiers stationed there described an overwhelming feeling of being watched, shadows flickering in their periphery, and noises, snapping branches, low rumbles, that kept them from sleep. Within weeks, the operation was quietly moved elsewhere. In the 1970s, a group of hunters stayed overnight among the ruins. They claimed the ground trembled under their tents as something walked past, breathing heavily, circling. In the morning, they found tracks the size of dinner plates pressed deep into the mud. Portlock's curse is amplified by the nature of Alaska itself. In winter, the sun sets early and does not rise again for long stretches. Darkness presses down like a weight, broken only by the howl of the wind and the occasional crack of ice. Imagine standing in that abandoned village, the cabins creaking, the surf pounding against the rocks, the tree line looming black against the sky. In that silence, every sound becomes amplified. A twig snapping, a breath of air, footsteps that may not be yours. This is what makes Portlock unbearable. The sense that the land itself has eyes, that in the endless night you are never truly alone. To this day, Portlock remains deserted. Tourists rarely attempt to visit, and when they do, they seldom linger overnight. Locals refuse to speak of it. Elders shake their heads at the name Nantinak, and every so often, a fisherman reports screams drifting over the water, or a hunter swears he sees something massive watching from the ridge. Skeptics call it superstition, a story born of fear, isolation, and the brutality of Alaskan winters. But believers ask a single haunting question. Why did an entire community abandon their homes overnight? Why leave behind belongings, boats, and livelihoods without so much as a warning? People do not leave without reason. Something drove them away. There are those who say Portlock is cursed. Others believe the Nantinak still roams the ridges, waiting for the bold or foolish to return. And a few whisper that the land itself is alive, that the spirits of the mountain claimed what was theirs and will not release it. If you walk through the ruins today, the silence feels unnatural, as though the village itself is holding its breath. Windows gape like open mouths. Moss crawls over the cannery walls, and at the edge of the forest, the tree line stands dark and watchful. Some who have visited say they felt a deep vibration beneath their feet, not an earthquake, but the heavy footfall of something unseen. Others claim they heard whispers carried on the wind, words they could not understand. And then there are those who never speak of their time there at all. They come back pale. The Inside Passage of Alaska is a labyrinth of fjords, towering cliffs, and icy waters. For centuries, it has been the lifeline of coastal villages, a watery highway connecting the scattered communities that cling to the shoreline. But beneath its beauty, the Inside Passage has always carried a reputation for treachery. Ships vanish in the fog. Kayakers go missing in calm waters. Entire search parties have returned empty-handed. Among the Tlingit people, these mysteries are not random accidents of nature. They are the work of something older than the forests, older than the tides themselves, the Kushtaka. The word translates loosely as land otter-man. To outsiders, it may sound like folklore. But to those who live along the coast, the Kushtaka are predators that linger in the in-between places, not quite human, not quite animal. According to legend, they are shapeshifters. They walk on two legs like men, but they can slip into the water as easily as otters. Their fur glistens like wet kelp. Their hands bear claws, and their eyes shine with a cruel intelligence. But what makes them most dangerous is not their form. It is their voice. The Kushtaka can mimic the sound of a crying child, a lost fisherman, or even a trusted friend. They lure the living toward the water, promising safety or companionship, only to drag them under. The Tlingit say that the Kushtaka do not merely kill, they transform. A victim who falls into their grasp may be turned into another Kushtaka, bound to the shoreline for eternity, forever calling out to the next soul to wander too close. In 1900, gold prospector Harry Culp and his crew ventured near Thomas Bay, a jagged stretch of the Inside Passage that locals still call the Bay of Death. Culp had heard warnings, but fortune seekers rarely listened. What happened next became one of the earliest written accounts of the Kushtaka. According to Culp's journal, his partner was the first to encounter them. The man returned to camp white as snow, rambling about devil creatures. He said he had been following what sounded like a child's voice deeper into the woods. The cries echoed between the trees, sometimes near, sometimes far, but always just out of reach. When he finally broke through a clearing, he saw figures moving in the mist, short, broad-shouldered shapes, covered in wet fur. Their faces were grotesque, somewhere between human and otter, with gleaming teeth. The prospector dropped his supplies and ran. Culp himself would later claim he heard the cries too, faint at first, then unbearably close, as though someone was whispering directly behind him in the forest. The men abandoned their camp and never returned. In his memoirs, Culp wrote a chilling warning: "Take heed. If you value your life and your soul, stay far from Thomas Bay." A century later, in 1998, a fisherman named Daniel told his story to his local radio station in Juneau. It was late October, and the seas were rough, but Daniel had grown up on these waters. He knew every inlet and shoal, every rock hidden just beneath the tide. On his return trip, he cut the engine and let the boat drift for a moment. The fog was thick, curling around him like smoke. That's when he heard it. The unmistakable cry of a baby. At first, he thought he was imagining it. But then it came again, high-pitched, sharp, echoing across the waves. Daniel's blood ran cold. He was miles from shore. There were no villages nearby, no boats in sight. Yet the sound persisted. He reached for his radio, ready to call the Coast Guard, when he noticed something in the water. A dark shape bobbing between the swells, too large to be a seal, but moving with the same strange fluidity. Then a voice, no longer a baby's cry, but a man's voice calling his name. Clear, familiar. It was his brother's voice. The problem was, Daniel's brother had died 3 years earlier in a boating accident. The shape rose higher from the water, revealing a head with slick fur and a long snout. Its mouth stretched into what looked like a grin. The voice called again, softer now, coaxing, inviting him to lean over the edge. Daniel tore the engine cord and sped away, refusing to look back. In his testimony, he said, "If I had listened any longer, I know I wouldn't be here. It wanted me in the water. It wanted me to believe." Reports of the Kushtaka stretch from Petersburg to Ketchikan, Sitka to Juneau. Some accounts describe the creatures as saviors, rescuing those lost in the cold and carrying them to safety. But most testimonies paint a darker picture of deception, of voices luring the weak-willed, of vanishing travelers. Anthropologists suggest the Kushtaka myth may have served as a cultural warning. In a landscape where hypothermia can strike within minutes, where drowning is a constant threat, the legend of a predator luring you into icy waters is a powerful deterrent. But even skeptics struggle to explain the consistency of the stories. Generations apart, miles apart, people claim to hear the same cries. A child, a woman, a familiar voice, calling them toward the water. One detail recurs again and again. The victims describe an overwhelming sense of confusion, as though their minds were clouded. Some even report gaps in memory, surfacing hours later without explanation. In 2006, 2 young kayakers went missing near Ketchikan. Their bodies were never recovered. Locals whispered about the Kushtaka, and at first authorities dismissed it as folklore interfering with grief. But one witness changed that perception. A woman walking along the shoreline claimed she saw the pair just before they disappeared. She said they were paddling steadily, but then they stopped. Both turned their heads in unison, as if listening to something she couldn't hear. They looked at each other, then began paddling toward deeper waters, away from the shoreline, away from safety. She shouted, waved, but they ignored her. Then, as fog rolled in, she thought she saw something dark slip into the water beside their kayaks. Moments later, they were gone. To this day, neither kayaker has been found. Their families still receive letters from locals who insist the Kushtaka are to blame. What makes the Kushtaka especially terrifying during Alaska's endless night is the soundscape. In perpetual darkness, the human mind relies more heavily on hearing. Every splash, every whisper of wind through the trees, every crack of ice is amplified. When the Kushtaka call, their voices carry further, bouncing across the black water. Imagine standing on the deck of a small boat, fog pressing in from all sides. You can't see more than a few feet in front of you. Then faintly, you hear someone crying for help. You're alone. There's no logical explanation, but instinct urges you to move closer. That's when the water ripples, and the real terror begins. To this day, the Coast Guard receives calls of voices on the water. Sometimes it's written off as sound carrying strangely through the fog. Other times, the reports are never explained. Fishermen swap stories in hushed tones, refusing to repeat them near the docks for fear of inviting bad luck. And among the Tlingit elders, the warnings remain clear. Never follow the cries. Never trust a voice that comes from the water, because once the Kushtaka have your attention, it's already too late. The howling winds of Aniakchak Pass, the Alaska Peninsula stretches like a crooked finger into the Bering Sea, a place of volcanoes, ash plains, and unforgiving wilderness. Few ever set foot in its interior, and fewer still return. It is here, deep in the Katmai Anchorage corridor, that the Aniakchak crater yawns like a wound in the earth, a 6-mile-wide caldera carved by one of the most violent volcanic eruptions in human history. Within its broken walls lies Aniakchak Pass, a narrow corridor of jagged rock where winds scream with unnatural force. Meteorologists measure gusts at hurricane strength, yet the skies remain deceptively calm. Pilots who fly overhead say the air vibrates with something more than weather. They describe a sound like a human voice carried on the gale, a shriek that rises and falls, echoing as though dozens, sometimes hundreds, of unseen throats are wailing in unison. For centuries, the native Alutiiq people avoided Aniakchak, calling it the place where the earth remembers. They spoke of spirits trapped in the crater, the restless dead of entire villages wiped away by fire and ash. Their warnings were simple: do not sleep near the pass. Do not listen too long to the wind. In the summer of 1922, a geological survey crew hiked into Aniakchak to chart its terrain. Their reports remain archived in Anchorage, but one journal, preserved by a field assistant named Robert Worth, contains entries that have disturbed historians for decades. On July 19th, Worth wrote, "The wind grew suddenly violent, though the skies were perfectly clear. It howled like a chorus of voices, shrieking so loudly we could not speak to one another. I swore I heard my name carried on the gusts, whispered in a tone that chilled me to my marrow." Others confessed the same. At night, no one slept. The cries continued, and though we were many miles from the sea, the air smelled of salt water and rot. By the end of the expedition, 2 men had deserted. They fled at night, leaving behind their gear. No trace of them was ever found. Decades later, in 1977, bush pilot Raymond Cole reported a near-disastrous flight over Aniakchak. He had ferried supplies for fishermen before, but this time his route carried him directly across the crater. As he passed over the pass, turbulence struck his plane without warning. The craft shook violently, instruments spinning, his altimeter useless. He fought for control, but what terrified him most was not the storm. It was the sound. Through the static of his radio headset, he heard screaming. Not mechanical feedback, not wind distortion. Human screaming. Multiple voices rising together in an unholy wail. One voice cut through clearer than the rest. The voice of his late wife, who had died of pneumonia 3 years earlier. Raymond nearly lost control of the aircraft. He banked hard, avoiding the crater, and did not breathe until the shrieking faded into silence. Later, when he landed in King Salmon, he told friends he would never fly near Aniakchak again. "That place doesn't want the living," he said. In 2002, 3 hikers attempted to cross Aniakchak Pass during midsummer when daylight lingers nearly all night. Their journals, later recovered from a campsite, detail growing unease. One entry reads, "Wind never stops here. It doesn't feel like weather. It feels like voices pressing against our skulls. We keep hearing things that aren't there. Last night, Mark swore he heard his mother calling him from the rocks. He almost followed it. 2 days later, a storm struck. Search and rescue teams later found the abandoned camp, gear scattered, food left uneaten. Only one body was recovered, miles from the crater rim. The other 2 hikers were never found. Rangers note that visibility had been clear when they vanished. The survivor's journal ended abruptly with a final, chilling line. "If I listen too long, I think I'll answer them." Geologists argue the winds of Aniakchak are the result of violent air pressure shifts caused by the crater's unusual structure. The pass acts as a funnel, compressing air into a shrieking gale. Yet this explanation does little to calm those who've stood there. Visitors report feelings of overwhelming dread, sudden nausea, or hallucinations. Some describe phantom smells, burning sulfur, decaying flesh, or briny seawater, when no such sources exist. Others claim to hear voices calling their names in tones eerily familiar, like lost relatives or childhood friends. Anthropologists note that the Alutiiq avoided this place not because of superstition alone, but because of generational memory. Entire communities had perished when the volcano erupted centuries ago. Survivors claim to hear the death cries of the fallen echoing long after the ash settled. During Alaska's endless night, Aniakchak Pass becomes more terrifying still. The blackness of winter swallows the crater whole, and the winds grow louder. Rangers refuse to patrol the area after dusk, and pilots avoid flying overhead entirely. One ranger anonymously confessed to hearing a chorus of voices singing, not screaming, but singing in low, mournful tones, while he camped near the rim in 2011. He lasted one night before abandoning his post. "It sounded like a funeral march," he said, like the earth itself was mourning. Locals in nearby villages speak of lights flickering above the pass, pale blue flares that shimmer and vanish when approached. They call them the spirits of the crater, souls forever trapped by the eruption that buried them alive. In recent years, hikers still vanish around Aniakchak. Most are attributed to the extreme weather, sudden storms, and the unforgiving terrain. But some disappearances defy explanation. Experienced climbers walk into the pass and are never seen again, their gear and remains unrecovered. Search teams sometimes report hearing faint voices over the wind, the cries of those they're trying to find. Yet when they follow, the voices always lead them deeper into the storm, farther from safety. Aniakchak remains one of the least visited places in Alaska. Tourists rarely venture there, and locals keep their distance. Those who've stood in the pass say they can still hear it, the endless shrieking, like thousands of souls caught in an eternal gale. Some believe the crater is a wound that never healed, a scar of fire where the earth remembers its dead. Others think it is a doorway where the veil between the living and the lost is thinner than anywhere else. What is certain is this: the winds of Aniakchak Pass are not just weather. They are voices, and they are still screaming. In 2015, an experienced mountaineer named Caleb Morton attempted to cross Aniakchak Pass with 2 companions. The ghosts of Eklutna Cemetery, along the Glen Highway, just 26 miles northeast of Anchorage, lies a graveyard unlike any other in Alaska. To passing drivers, it may look almost quaint. Rows of brightly painted wooden houses, small and colorful, scattered among birch and spruce. But these are not houses. They are spirit houses, unique burial shrines of the Athabaskan people, later blended with Russian Orthodox tradition. The Eklutna cemetery is more than a resting place. It is a crossroads of cultures, beliefs, and souls, and many who have walked its grounds at night claim it is not silent. The dead, they say, still stir. The Athabaskan custom was simple. When a person died, their spirit lingered near their body for a year. A small wooden house was built over the grave, a place for the spirit to dwell until it completed its journey. When Russian missionaries arrived in the 1800s, they imposed their faith, but rather than erase tradition, the two merged. The graves remained crowned with tiny houses, painted in vivid blues, reds, and yellows, but adorned with Orthodox crosses. It is beautiful in daylight, a place of history and reverence. But in the endless Alaskan night, when the snow buries the houses to their roofs and the aurora flickers green above the trees, the cemetery takes on a darker presence. Locals whisper that Eklutna is not empty after dusk. The spirits there are restless, watching, waiting. Some even step beyond the fences. In 1989, Park Ranger William Hayes was tasked with patrolling the grounds after repeated reports of vandalism. Teenagers had been sneaking into the cemetery at night, knocking over crosses and carving initials into spirit houses. Hayes was determined to catch them in the act, but one night, he experienced something that would haunt him for the rest of his career. Around midnight, with frost glazing the grass, Hayes walked the perimeter with a flashlight. The air was so still he could hear his own breath. As he neared the back of the cemetery, his light caught movement, a figure standing between two spirit houses. Hayes called out, demanding they identify themselves. The figure didn't move. It was small, slight, dressed in what looked like old-fashioned clothing. As Hayes approached, the figure turned its head slowly toward him. He swore later that its eyes glowed pale, like moonlit water. Then, without a sound, it sank down, not walking, not running, but sinking straight into the earth. Hayes fled, abandoning his patrol. He later admitted in private that he never filed an official report because he feared ridicule, but he never returned to the cemetery alone again. Among the cemetery's most enduring legends is the Bride of Eklutna. Local lore tells of a young Athabaskan woman who fell in love with a Russian missionary. Their union was forbidden, and the girl was said to have died under mysterious circumstances. Some claim by suicide, others whisper by murder. Visitors report seeing her ghost still wandering the grounds. Dressed in a tattered white gown, she appears at the edge of the cemetery fence, drifting slowly between the trees. Sometimes she is seen kneeling at certain graves, rocking back and forth as though weeping. In 1996, two teenage girls claimed they were chased by the apparition after sneaking into the cemetery late at night. They described hearing soft sobbing that grew louder until it turned into a wail. When they turned, they saw a figure in white hovering just above the snow, moving toward them at unnatural speed. The girls screamed and fled to the road, where a passing driver picked them up. He later confirmed their clothes were wet with frost as if they had been dragged across snow, but there had been no snow that night. One of the most frequently reported phenomena at Eklutna Cemetery is the appearance of strange lights. In 2007, a local photographer visited the cemetery to capture long exposure shots of the aurora borealis. While adjusting his camera, he noticed small orbs of blue and orange light weaving between the spirit houses. At first, he assumed they were reflections, but when he checked his film, the lights appeared clearly, distinct, separate from the aurora above. Some believe these lights are the souls of the dead, still inhabiting their wooden houses. Others argue they are warnings, spectral lanterns meant to ward off intruders. Skeptics dismiss them as atmospheric tricks, but those who have stood beneath the shifting colors of the northern sky insist the lights move with purpose, darting toward the living when they linger too long. During Alaska's deep winter, when darkness reigns for 20 hours at a stretch, the cemetery becomes a place few dare enter. Yet in 2012, a paranormal research team spent 3 nights among the graves. Their recordings captured faint whispers in both English and the Athabaskan language, saying phrases such as, "Leave us," and "Stay away." On their final night, one investigator was left alone inside the cemetery with a recorder. Minutes later, he was heard shouting in terror, When the others rushed back, they found him standing rigid, his eyes unfocused, whispering, "They're in the houses. They're watching me." He refused to return to the site and reportedly abandoned paranormal research altogether. What makes Eklutna Cemetery so unsettling is not just its folklore, but its atmosphere. Visitors often describe sudden chills, the sensation of being touched, or hearing footsteps in the snow when no one else is there. The Athabaskan elders still urge respect for the graves. They say the spirit houses are not symbolic. They are real homes, temporary shelters for the dead. To disturb them is to invite their wrath. One elder put it simply, "They are not gone. They are only waiting, and at night they remember who comes near." Today the cemetery remains active, with modern burials joining centuries-old ones. Tourists visit during the day, taking photographs of the colorful spirit houses. Guides share stories with a reverent tone, reminding visitors of the blending of cultures. But after dusk, the cemetery empties. The painted houses stand silent under the stars, snow drifting against their walls, the aurora rippling above, and those who have dared to linger say the silence is deceptive. For in the stillness, if you listen carefully, you may hear a door creak open on a house too small for any living occupant, or the faint sobbing of a bride who never found rest. Or perhaps your own name, whispered from the shadows between the graves. The Eklutna Cemetery is not abandoned. Its residents have simply never left. Eklutna Cemetery is not vast or sprawling. Tucked just north of Anchorage, it looks almost fragile against the expanse of forest and sky. Visitors often describe it as otherworldly, a place that feels both sacred and unsettling. Brightly painted wooden spirit houses dot the grounds, each resting over a grave. The tradition comes from the Denaina Athabaskans. The house is built for the spirit of the deceased. The Phantom Lights of Coldfoot, Alaska, sits far north along the Dalton Highway, a place where the land seems to stretch forever and the night lasts longer than the day. Originally a gold mining camp in the late 1800s, Coldfoot gained its peculiar name from prospectors who turned back, too frozen and fearful to continue. Today, it is a lonely truck stop, a speck of warmth along one of the most desolate highways in America. But Coldfoot is known for more than its remoteness. It is the gateway to endless wilderness and to strange lights that haunt the skies and the roadways alike. The aurora borealis, the northern lights, dance above Coldfoot with hypnotic beauty. But locals insist there are other lights, not celestial or natural, but spectral. They are smaller, closer to the ground, and far more sinister. Travelers call them the Phantom Lights of Coldfoot. The Denaina and Koyukon Athabaskans have stories of the wandering fires, flickering orbs that move along rivers and tree lines. Some traditions say they are spirits of the dead, guiding hunters or leading them astray. Others warn they are hungry souls, seeking warmth from the living. When prospectors arrived in the gold rush era, they too recorded strange sightings. Miners spoke of orbs glowing between tents, darting just beyond lantern light. Some thought them signs of good fortune. Others saw them as omens of death. And soon after, death always seemed to follow. A mine collapse, a sudden illness, a man frozen only yards from safety. The lights were not the northern aurora. They were too low, too mobile, too responsive to human presence. The Dalton Highway that cuts through Coldfoot is notorious, a 400-mile stretch of treacherous ice, blizzards, and sheer loneliness. Truckers who drive it often say the road feels alive, as though it knows who travels it. One such trucker, named Carl, described an experience in the early 2000s. He was hauling a tanker north, the night sky hidden behind storm clouds, when a blue-white glow appeared in his mirrors. At first he thought it was another vehicle, but no headlights approached. The light stayed behind him, perfectly centered, following. When he slowed, it slowed. When he pulled to the shoulder, the light drifted past his truck, not on the road, but hovering 2 feet above the snow. It pulsed once, twice, then vanished into the forest. Carl swore he felt warmth inside his cab as it passed, though his windshield was coated in frost. He refused to drive nights through Coldfoot for nearly a year afterward. In 2014, a tourist couple from Germany stopped in Coldfoot to photograph the aurora. They set up their tripod near the highway and began shooting long exposures. Later, when reviewing the images, they noticed streaks of light weaving through the trees. At first, they assumed it was car headlights. But the trails twisted, looped, and rose above the tree line. More chilling still, one exposure showed a clear orb hovering only a few feet behind them. Though they swore no light had been there in the moment, the husband laughed it off at first. But weeks later, back home, he began waking to flickering glows in his bedroom. Brief, darting lights that disappeared as soon as he sat up. He would later write in an online forum, "They followed us." I know they did. You don't leave Coldfoot unchanged. In 2019, a University of Alaska physics student attempted to debunk the legends. He set up equipment near Coldfoot to measure electromagnetic activity, ionization, and atmospheric interference. For 2 nights, his instruments recorded nothing unusual. On the third, his logbook abruptly stopped mid-sentence. The entry read, "There is a light hovering near the tree line. Too low for Aurora, moving irregularly. Approaching." The notebook was found days later, abandoned with his camp. The student himself was discovered wandering the Dalton Highway barefoot, incoherent and frostbitten. He never returned to his studies. When pressed, he muttered only, "It wasn't light, it was watching me." Coldfoot's phantom lights are not rare tales told once a generation. They are consistent, recorded by truckers, hunters, tourists, and locals alike. Some describe them as blue-white orbs, others as green flickers, still others as fire-colored globes that seem to pulse like a heartbeat. They appear in blizzards, in clear skies, even under the bright shimmer of the aurora. Always they are near the road, never quite letting travelers forget that they are not alone. One unsettling detail repeats across testimonies. The lights seem aware. They mimic headlights, approach cautiously, and vanish the moment someone tries to investigate. They do not illuminate like normal light. Instead, they glow without casting shadows, as if their brightness exists only for the eye, not the world around them. An old journal, discovered in a Coldfoot cabin abandoned since the early 1900s, contains a chilling account. A prospector wrote that he followed a strange orb through the woods, believing it might lead to another campfire. He wrote, "It darted like a will-o'-the-wisp, always just beyond reach. When I finally stopped, I saw more of them, circling in silence. And in the glow, I swear I saw faces, hollow, gaunt, their mouths open in soundless screams. I dropped my pen and ran. I will not follow them again." The final entry of the journal is dated only 2 days later. The prospector never wrote again. His name is not found in any other records. Even today, Coldfoot draws those fascinated by the paranormal. Ghost hunters, researchers, and thrill seekers drive the Dalton Highway hoping to glimpse the phantom lights. Some succeed. Many leave unsettled. The truth of the lights remains unsolved. Science suggests plasma, atmospheric electricity, or misidentified aurora. But those who have seen them, truckers gripping their wheels, tourists trembling behind cameras, locals lowering their voices, insist the lights are something else entirely, something sentient, something that watches. And when you stop in Coldfoot, as you must if you travel the Dalton Highway, you cannot help but glance into the trees at night. You might see them hovering there, waiting, and if you're unlucky, they just might follow you when you leave. Coldfoot, Alaska, sits far north along the Dalton Highway, a lonely stretch of asphalt often called one of the most dangerous roads in America. The highway is long, treacherous, and seemingly endless, cutting through a wilderness of mountains, rivers, and frozen valleys. To drive it at night is to step into another world, where time feels suspended and the silence presses down heavier than the snow. Coldfoot itself began as a fleeting boomtown during the late 1800s gold rush. Prospectors trudged north with dreams of fortune, but most turned back. Their feet grew too cold, their spirits too weary, and the camp earned its chilling name. Today, Coldfoot is little more than a truck stop, a scattering of cabins, and a handful of residents. Yet for such a tiny place, its reputation looms large, not for its gold, not even for its isolation, but for the lights. The phantom lights of Coldfoot are not the aurora borealis. The aurora dazzles overhead with ribbons of green, pink, and violet, vast curtains draping the Arctic sky. The phantom lights are smaller, closer. They linger near tree lines and riverbanks, drift across highways, and hover as though curious. Dena'ina and Koyukon Athabascan legends speak of the wandering fires. To some, they are spirits of hunters guiding the lost. To others, they are hungry souls seeking warmth. And if you follow, you might never return. Gold Rush diaries echo the same. Miners wrote of glowing orbs darting between tents, bobbing like lanterns. Some men swore the lights led them to fortune, while others told of companions lured into the woods, found frozen days later. The lights, they said, were omens, but even when the rush ended, the stories never did. Truckers keep the Dalton Highway alive, ferrying fuel and supplies through the Arctic. They are used to long nights, to hallucinations of fatigue, to tricks of the snow, and yet many of them will tell you Coldfoot is different. One trucker, Carl, spoke of a night in 2001 when the snow was falling thick, blanketing the world in silence. The vanishing hitchhiker of Sterling Highway. The Sterling Highway winds south from Anchorage, cutting through forests, rivers, and fjords before reaching the fishing town of Homer. It is one of Alaska's most traveled roads, yet at night it becomes something else entirely. The further you drive, the more the darkness thickens, swallowing headlights and muffling sound. The road bends and twists through forests that look identical mile after mile, as though you are driving in circles. And always there is the weight of the wilderness pressing against your windows, vast, endless, and indifferent. But for decades, the Sterling Highway has carried more than just fishermen, truckers, and tourists. It has carried a legend. They say she appears on cold nights near Cooper Landing, or sometimes closer to Kenai. A young woman, pale and alone, standing by the roadside. Some drivers describe her in jeans and a parka, others in a white dress far too thin for the weather. Her hair is always long and dark, her skin pale against the night. She raises one hand, a silent plea for a ride. Those who stop say she speaks little, her voice soft, her words clipped. She asks only to be taken further down the road. Some drivers report she smells faintly of river water. Others say the air grows strangely cold in the cab when she enters, and without fail, at some point along the journey, she disappears. Sometimes when the driver glances away, sometimes when headlights from oncoming cars briefly blind them, and sometimes, most chillingly, mid-conversation. One moment she is there, the next, the seat is empty, though the seatbelt remains buckled. Faint warmth lingers on the cushion, and the smell of damp earth clings to the air. Local folklore ties the hitchhiker to a drowning near the Kenai River decades ago. The story varies. In one version, she was a young woman whose car slid off an icy bridge, plunging into the black waters. In another, she was a fisherman's daughter who vanished in a sudden storm. The river claimed her, the stories say, but she never found rest. The Dena'ina Athabascans speak of spirits who linger at places of sudden death. They believe such souls are drawn to the living, seeking warmth, seeking acknowledgement, seeking a final ride they can never complete. And so, drivers continue to see her. The trucker's account in 1999, a long-haul trucker named Dave was heading south on the Sterling around 2 a.m. The fog was thick, the road nearly deserted, when his headlights picked out a figure standing on the shoulder. He slowed, uneasy at leaving someone stranded in the freezing dark. The woman climbed into his cab without a word, shivering faintly, though her clothes were dry. Dave asked where she was headed, and she whispered, "South." They drove in silence, for several miles before she finally said, "It's cold in the river." Startled, Dave turned to look at her and found the seat empty. The passenger door was still shut, the seatbelt still fastened. Only the smell of wet moss remained. Dave swore he never picked up another hitchhiker again. In 2007, a young couple driving home from Homer claimed they encountered the same apparition. They saw a woman standing by the guardrail, her dress impossibly thin against the falling snow. They pulled over. She got in, thanked them softly, and asked for a ride north. She sat in the back seat, her gaze fixed out the window. The couple asked where she was from, but she did not answer. A few miles later, the wife turned around to check on her. The back seat was empty. When they reported the encounter to friends, an older local nodded knowingly and said, "She walks that road every winter. Don't stop again. She's looking for something none of us can give her." One of the most chilling accounts comes from an Alaska state trooper in 2013. Responding to a call about a stranded pedestrian, he drove the Sterling and spotted a woman in white walking along the roadside. He pulled over, illuminated the figure with his spotlight and stepped out. The woman raised her arm as though signaling for help, but as he drew closer, she dissolved into the mist. He searched the roadside for half an hour, certain his eyes had deceived him. But his dashcam footage later revealed something he couldn't explain, a faint figure illuminated in the beam of his spotlight, vanishing into nothingness in less than a second. The footage never reached the public. The officer, years later, spoke of it anonymously. "I don't know what I saw, but she was real enough for the camera." What makes the Sterling Highway hitchhiker disturbing is not just her appearances, but the eerie consistency of the stories. Different witnesses, across decades, describe the same pale woman, the same cold presence, the same sudden vanishing. Folklore scholars note the similarity to vanishing hitchhiker tales worldwide, from Archer Avenue in Illinois to rural highways in Japan. But the Sterling apparition feels darker, more persistent. Perhaps because the road itself is so isolated, the wilderness so suffocating, that her presence feels inevitable. She does not simply vanish. She lingers, in the scent of water, the chill in the air, the memory that refuses to fade. Some locals insist you should never stop for her. They say the hitchhiker is not a harmless spirit, but a lure, meant to draw the living toward the same fate she suffered. A few even claim that those who stop too often find themselves haunted. Beyond the highway, waking to wet footprints in their homes, or the sensation of someone sitting on the edge of their bed at night. One chilling story tells of a man from Kenai who picked her up 3 times over the course of 2 winters. After the third, he began dreaming of drowning, waking with his sheets damp and his throat raw as if he had swallowed water. Within months, his car skidded off the Sterling into the Kenai River. His body was never recovered. What is she seeking? Some say she wants to reach Homer, where her family once lived. Others believe she is forever retracing the final drive of her life, doomed to replay it with strangers. Whatever the truth, the Sterling Highway hitchhiker remains one of Alaska's most chilling road legends. She is a reminder of the fragility of life against ice, water, and distance, and of the way sudden death can tether a soul to the earth. So if you find yourself driving the Sterling Highway late at night, keep your eyes on the roadside. If you see a pale woman standing in the snow, hand raised for a ride, think carefully before you stop, because if you let her in, she may not leave, and even if she does, you may find she isn't finished with you. The phantom ship of Glacier Bay National Park is one of the most breathtaking places in Alaska. Towering ice cliffs, fjords carved by millennia, and waters so still they reflect the mountains like glass. But beneath its beauty lies a reputation locals rarely discuss with tourists. Mariners, fishermen, and even park rangers whisper about something that moves through these waters on moonless nights. A ghost ship that emerges from the fog, sails silently across the bay, and vanishes without a trace. It has no name painted on its hull. No modern equipment is visible. Its rigging creaks, though no wind blows. Some say it resembles a 19th century vessel. the kind that carried explorers into the icy wilderness in search of gold, furs, or new passage routes. Others insist it's older still, a remnant of the doomed Russian expeditions that once tried to tame Alaska's unforgiving waters. No matter its origin, one thing is certain: those who have seen the ship never forget it. In 1974, two fishermen anchored overnight in Bartlett Cove, near the park's ranger station. Around 2 a.m., they awoke to the sound of wood groaning and ropes snapping. At first, they believed another vessel was drifting dangerously close to their own. When they climbed on deck, they froze. A massive schooner was passing silently through the cove, its sails tattered, its masts leaning at impossible angles. But there was no wake behind it. The water remained perfectly calm. The men reported seeing figures on deck, their movements jerky like shadows cast by a flickering light. One raised an arm pointing directly toward them. The fishermen panicked, trying to start their engine. But their motor refused to turn. Only when the schooner drifted past and dissolved into mist did the motor roar back to life. They left Glacier Bay that very night and never returned. Park rangers, sworn to uphold a scientific and rational view of the wilderness, have also encountered the unexplained. In 1992, Ranger Matthew Hughes was conducting a night patrol by boat. At the mouth of Reed Inlet, he spotted what appeared to be a vessel drifting dangerously close to the glaciers. Concerned it might be a tourist charter that had lost power, Hughes radioed the ship but received no reply. As he drew closer, he noticed details that chilled him. Sails hanging in tatters, decks slick with ice, and no navigation lights. Through binoculars, he swore he saw faces staring back at him from the railings, pale, hollow-eyed, their mouths moving in silent screams. Before he could approach further, a wall of fog rolled across the bay, and the vessel disappeared. When the fog lifted minutes later, there was nothing. The waters were empty, undisturbed, as though the ship had never been there at all. Hughes filed a report, but later admitted he left out key details, fearing ridicule from colleagues. "I know what I saw," he told a friend years later. It wasn't a mirage. It was a ship of the dead. The legends trace back to the late 1800s when Glacier Bay was a treacherous, uncharted region. Dozens of ships were lost here, crushed by shifting ice or swallowed by sudden storms. One vessel, the Star of Olympia, reportedly vanished in 1898 with 40 souls aboard. It was last sighted sailing into the bay during a gold-seeking expedition. When search parties arrived weeks later, they found only floating timbers and abandoned lifeboats. Locals say the phantom ship is the Star of Olympia, forever repeating its doomed journey. Others argue it represents not one, but all the ships that perished in Alaska's waters. A spectral amalgamation of lost sailors condemned to wander until the sea releases them. In 2007, 3 kayakers set out to camp along the shoreline of Johns Hopkins Inlet. After dark, they sat outside their tents, listening to the groans of nearby glaciers calving into the water. Suddenly, they noticed a glow on the horizon. At first, they thought it was the moon breaking through clouds. But the light moved strangely, reflecting off sails. As the glow approached, the shape of a tall ship emerged, luminous and translucent. The kayakers watched in stunned silence as the ship glided across the inlet, its sails filled by no wind, its hull hovering just above the water's surface. They claimed they could see straight through parts of it, like mist caught in moonlight. One of them whispered that he heard faint music, fiddles perhaps, or singing voices, echoing across the bay. The others swore they heard nothing, only the creak of timbers. Within minutes, the ship dissolved into the night air. When they returned to Juneau, they told no one at first. Only years later did one of the men reveal the story during a podcast interview, his voice shaking even a decade later. Skeptics insist the phantom ship is a trick of the light, the product of reflections off icebergs and shifting fog. Mariners know that mirages, fata morgana, can warp distant ships into ghostly shapes. But these explanations falter in the face of consistent details. The same tattered sails, the same spectral crew, the same chilling silence reported across decades. Those who believe argue that Glacier Bay is cursed, a place where the sea refuses to release its dead. The waters here are deep and cold, capable of preserving bodies for decades. Perhaps the spirits of drowned sailors cling to their vessels, endlessly replaying their last voyage. And if the bay itself is alive, as some native legends suggest, then perhaps it holds on to these ships as trophies, forcing them to drift in eternal Silence as warnings to the living. One of the most chilling modern encounters occurred in 2016 aboard a cruise ship, passing through Glacier Bay. A group of passengers gathered on deck late at night, taking photos of the ice cliffs. Several later testified that they saw a ghostly outline of a sailing ship moving parallel to their own, close enough that it should have appeared on radar. Yet when the captain checked, no other vessels were detected. One passenger reviewing his digital photos afterward found something unnerving. In one frame, barely visible through the mist, a tall ship floated across the water, blurred, luminous, and unmistakable. The next frame showed only open sea. The image was quietly dismissed by the cruise company as lens distortion, but those who saw it in person knew better. Glacier Bay remains one of Alaska's greatest wonders, but also one of its most haunted. Fishermen whisper about the phantom ship when tourists aren't listening. Rangers pass the story down quietly, never officially recording it. And every few years, a traveler emerges with the same account. A ghostly vessel, its sails in tatters, gliding silently through the icy waters, crewed by shadows that never reach shore. Some say if you see the ship, you are marked, that you'll dream of cold waters, of rigging snapping in the wind, of voices calling from beneath the waves. Others warn never to signal the vessel, never to wave or shine a light, for those who do are doomed to follow it. And so the ship sails on, unseen by most, unforgettable to the few who witness it. A reminder that Alaska's beauty hides something darker, that in places untouched by time, the past is never truly gone. When you stand on the shores of Glacier Bay on a moonless night, listen closely. If you hear the creak of ropes or the snap of canvas, you may not be alone. Look carefully across the water, but don't stare too long, because sometimes the lights of Lake Iliamna Lake. Iliamna, the largest lake in Alaska, stretches for over 1,000 square miles, a vast inland sea surrounded by mountains and tundra. Its waters run deep and cold, dark even under the summer sun. But at night, when the endless Alaskan winter blankets the land, something strange often stirs beneath the surface. For centuries, locals have reported mysterious lights rising from the lake, glowing orbs that drift across the water before vanishing into the sky. They move too deliberately to be reflections, too fast to be stars, too silent to be aircraft. Some glow white, others pulse red or green, and a few split into multiple orbs before merging again. To fishermen, these lights are omens. To the Dena'ina and Yupik peoples, they are spirits of the dead, forever bound to the lake. To modern researchers, they remain one of Alaska's most enduring mysteries. But to those who have encountered them firsthand, the lights of Lake Iliamna are more than mysterious. They are terrifying. In November 1982, bush pilot Andrew Keller was flying over the frozen lake when he saw what he thought was a flare shooting upward from the ice. He turned his plane to investigate, fearing a stranded snowmobiler or a downed aircraft. As he circled lower, the flare did something impossible. It curved in midair, hovered above the ice, and then darted straight toward his plane. Keller panicked, pulling his aircraft into a steep climb. The light followed, keeping pace with him even as he pushed his Cessna to its limits. Just when it seemed the orb would collide with his cockpit, it vanished, not by retreating, but by winking out of existence as though it had never been there. When Keller landed in Anchorage hours later, he swore never to fly over Iliamna at night again. He later told a friend, "That wasn't a flare. It wasn't anything human. It was watching me." 2 winters later, in 1984, a group of 4 fishermen were ice fishing on the lake when the surface beneath them began to glow with a strange bluish light. At first, they thought the ice was reflecting moonlight, but the moon was hidden behind heavy clouds. The glow intensified, spreading in a circle that surrounded their fishing holes. Then shapes began to form within it, long, shadowy figures swimming just below the ice. The men described them as serpent-like, larger than any fish known in the region. Suddenly, one of the lights burst upward, piercing through the ice without shattering it, rising into the air as a pulsing orb. It hovered silently above the fishermen before shooting skyward and vanishing into the night. The men packed their gear and fled the lake, refusing to return the following season. They later admitted that they never felt like they were looking at a natural phenomenon. Instead, they swore something was looking back at them through the ice. Long before modern settlers arrived, the native Dena'ina people warned of Nuchishtunt, The lights that follow. Elders told of souls who drowned in Iliamna, unable to cross into the spirit world, condemned to wander the waters in the form of glowing orbs. Hunters spoke of seeing the lights lure caribou onto thin ice, causing them to plunge into the freezing depths. Fishermen warned that if you followed the lights, they would lead you to dangerous waters, whirlpools, or sudden storms. One legend tells of a young woman who drowned while crossing the frozen lake to meet her lover. On moonless nights, her family claimed, a blue orb rose from the water near the site of her death, drifting slowly toward shore before sinking again. Some said if you listened closely, you could hear her voice crying through the ice. In 1999, 2 college students camping near Prudhoe Bay were woken at 3 a.m. by an eerie glow seeping through their tent. Thinking it was dawn, they stepped outside, only to see 3 orbs of light hovering just above the water. The lights pulsed in unison, slowly drifting closer to shore. The students tried to take photos, but their camera refused to function. When one of them raised a flashlight, the nearest orb darted toward them at inhuman speed, stopping only a few feet above their heads. The air grew electric, their hair standing on end as if charged. Then the orb let out a high-pitched hum that vibrated in their bones. Moments later, all 3 lights shot upward into the sky, vanishing in silence. The next morning, they found strange, scorched circles in the moss near their campsite, as though the ground had been burned without fire. The photos they tried to take developed blank. Skeptics argue the lights of Lake Iliamna are nothing more than ball lightning, swamp gas, or reflections from military aircraft. The lake does lie near air routes used by the military, and radar interference is not uncommon in the region, yet many details defy simple explanation. The lights often move with intelligence, circling boats, responding to flashlights, even chasing planes. They appear in weather conditions where ball lightning is impossible, and their consistency across centuries of folklore and modern accounts suggests something more than coincidence. In 2005, a team of researchers set up surveillance equipment along the shores of the lake for 6 months. They captured faint glows and strange electromagnetic spikes, but no conclusive evidence. However, one graduate assistant privately admitted that during one night of monitoring, a glowing orb approached the shoreline near their camp. The team refused to release his testimony, claiming it would damage scientific credibility. One of the most chilling legends tied to the lights speaks of an ancient village that once stood near the southern shore of Lake Iliamna. According to oral tradition, a great storm flooded the settlement, pulling dozens of families into the lake. The following winter, hunters reported glowing lights rising from the water where the village once stood. Even today, locals say the densest clusters of lights appear near that same location. Some believe the orbs are the souls of the drowned villagers, forever trying to return home. In 2017, a local man claimed he saw a cluster of more than a dozen orbs hovering over the water in that area. He watched in terror as they arranged themselves into a circle, slowly rotating before scattering in all directions. His account has never been explained. For all their beauty, the lights of Lake Iliamna carry menace. Witnesses often describe feeling drained, dizzy, or disoriented after close encounters. Animals react violently, dogs refuse to approach the shore, and caribou herds scatter when the orbs appear. One chilling case occurred in 2019, when 2 snowmobilers vanished on the frozen lake. Search parties later found their machines abandoned, tracks leading out onto the ice, and then stopping abruptly, as though the men had simply disappeared. Locals whispered that the lights had taken them, lured them into the dark, and pulled them beneath the ice. Lake Iliamna is a place of contradictions. Serene. The Wraith of Turnagain Arm south of Anchorage. The Seward Highway hugs a stretch of coastline known as Turnagain Arm. Here, jagged mountains plunge straight into the inlet, and the tides rise with violent force, some of the fastest in the world. Mudflats stretch like quicksand, pulling down anything unlucky enough to wander across them. On stormy nights, the water reflects no light, only darkness. The road feels less like a highway and more like a fragile ribbon caught between ocean and cliff. For decades, travelers have whispered of something else that haunts this stretch of asphalt. A pale, wraith-like figure that appears along the roadside, vanishes into the fog, and sometimes materializes directly in the path of cars. It is not just one driver's tale. Truckers, commuters, even state troopers have filed reports, describing a figure drenched and ragged, waving frantically, or simply standing motionless, watching as cars pass. And those who stop for it often regret they did. The earliest official record dates back to the mid-1950s. A state trooper was dispatched after a motorist swore he had nearly struck a woman wandering the highway near Girdwood. When the trooper arrived, he found no one, only wet footprints on the asphalt leading toward the inlet. They stopped abruptly at the edge of the mudflats, as though the figure had walked straight into the tide. The driver who reported her described a woman in soaked clothing, long hair plastered to her face, holding her arms out as though begging for help. But when she turned, he realized her eyes were completely white. Over the decades, truckers driving the Seward Highway late at night have kept the story alive. One driver, interviewed in 1979, claimed he saw a woman standing in the middle of the road during a snowstorm. He slammed his brakes, certain he would hit her, but instead drove through what felt like a wall of ice-cold air. His windshield frosted instantly from the inside, and when he pulled over, he swore he could still see handprints forming on the glass, pressed from the outside in. Another trucker in the 1990s said the figure appeared repeatedly in his rearview mirror, closer each time he looked. When he finally stopped to check his trailer, the mirror was empty. But when he climbed back into his cab, the passenger seat was dripping wet. Local folklore suggests the wraith may be tied to the violent tides of Turnagain Arm. Many lives have been lost to its treacherous waters, hunters caught on the mudflats, fishermen dragged under by surging waves, travelers misjudging the tides. Some speak of a 1930s tragedy when a small boat overturned during a boar tide, drowning an entire family. One story in particular matches the descriptions. A young woman named Eliza is said to have died trying to save her younger brother when their canoe capsized. Her body was never recovered. For years afterward, locals claimed to see her figure wandering the shore, searching for him. Some believe the wraith is Eliza, forever trapped between land and water, warning others of the same fate. In 2004, a couple driving home from Anchorage after a concert reported an encounter that left them shaken for life. Around 1:30 a.m. near Bird Point, they saw a woman waving from the shoulder of the road. Believing she was a stranded motorist, they pulled over. The woman staggered toward their car, hair dripping, clothes clinging to her thin frame. When she leaned into the window, the couple felt an overwhelming stench of salt water and decay. Her voice was barely audible as she whispered, "Help me find him." Terrified, the driver sped away. But when they reached Anchorage, they realized the back seat was soaked, water dripping onto the floor mats, though no one had entered the car. Not all encounters end in escape. In 2011, 3 teenagers parked near the shoreline on a dare to wait for the wraith. They claimed they wanted to capture her on video. Around 2 a.m., their camcorder began picking up audio interference, a low, droning hum. Then, a figure appeared in the distance, walking toward them across the mud. At first, they laughed, believing it was another camper. But when the figure drew closer, they saw her feet weren't sinking into the mud at all. She was gliding over it. The boys panicked, fumbling to start their car. When the engine finally roared to life, the figure was already at the driver's side window, her face pale, eyes milky white, mouth moving soundlessly. The footage, though grainy, was later leaked online. Most dismissed it as a hoax, but the boys swore to their graves it was real. They never returned to Turnagain Arm after dark. Skeptics argue the wraith is nothing more than exhaustion, fog, and imagination. Turnagain Arm is notorious for visual distortions caused by shifting tides, headlights reflecting on wet pavement, and fatigue from long drives. Combined with local ghost stories, it's easy to understand how drivers might think they've seen a spirit, but the consistency of the reports, the soaked clothing, the white eyes, the smell of brine, the chilling cold, is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Perhaps the most disturbing modern account came from a commuter in 2018, driving home late after a shift in Anchorage. Just past Potter Marsh, he spotted a woman standing in the middle of the lane. He swerved, narrowly avoiding her. When he looked in his mirror, She was gone. Relieved, he kept driving until his radio crackled with static, and a voice whispered through the speakers, "You should have stopped." Moments later, his windshield fogged over from the inside and handprints smeared across the glass. He drove the rest of the way home without daring to breathe, convinced something was sitting in the back seat. When he arrived, the car was bone dry, except for the faint smell of salt water. Turnagain Arm is already one of Alaska's most dangerous places. The tides claim lives every year. The mudflats suck victims into the sea, and storms roll in without warning. But for those who drive the Seward Highway after midnight, the greater danger may not be the elements. Some say the Wraith The silent watchers of Prudhoe Bay on Alaska's remote north slope is a place few outsiders will ever see. Here, endless tundra stretches to the horizon, broken only by oil rigs, icy seas, and bitter winds that howl without pause. In the long winter months, the sun disappears entirely, leaving a darkness so complete it feels alive. For oil workers and truckers who brave this landscape, isolation is the greatest danger. Yet some whisper of something worse. Beings that dwell in the frozen expanse, silently watching from just beyond the floodlights. They are not wolves. They are not men. They are something in between. Locals call them the Silent Watchers. The earliest accounts came in the 1970s, when Prudhoe Bay oil development was still new. Workers reported seeing tall, thin figures standing at the edges of construction sites, just beyond the reach of the lights. At first they assumed they were other men, until they realized the figures never moved. One worker described them as like silhouettes cut out of the night, taller than any man, with heads that seemed too narrow, too long. When approached, they would vanish without sound, as though swallowed by the tundra. Over time, the story spread. Crews began refusing to work the night shift alone. Security guards reported seeing figures standing at the perimeter fences, unmoving for hours, before vanishing the moment anyone drew closer. In 1986, a long-haul trucker hauling supplies along the Dalton Highway stopped near Prudhoe Bay to rest. He left his cab running for warmth, staring out at the flat, snow-covered plain. That's when he noticed them. 3 figures stood in the distance, just visible against the horizon. They didn't move, didn't shift, didn't even seem to breathe. He thought they might be other truckers stretching their legs. But then he realized how far out they were, beyond the drifts, where no one would willingly walk in that kind of cold. He turned on his high beams. The figures reflected nothing. Instead, the light seemed to bend around them, as though they weren't fully solid. Then, slowly, one of them lifted an arm, not waving, but pointing directly at his truck. The trucker floored it, refusing to stop until he reached Dead Horse. He later told colleagues, "I don't care if it costs me my job. I'm not parking out there again. They're not people." Inupiat elders have long spoken of beings that walk the tundra, neither spirit nor human, but something older. Some call them Tuniat, ancient people who were said to be stronger and taller than men, pushed into the margins of the earth when humans arrived. Others describe them as watchers, guardians of the land, hostile to those who intrude too far. One chilling tale warns that to make eye contact with them is to invite death. Hunters who locked eyes with the Silent Watchers were said to fall ill, wasting away as though the cold itself had entered their bones. Whether myth or memory, the oil workers' descriptions match these stories too closely to ignore. In 2002, a small team overseeing a rig near Prudhoe Bay reviewed security footage after a night of unexplained alarms. The cameras captured a series of tall, thin figures standing at the edge of the floodlight radius. Their proportions were wrong, too elongated, too narrow at the shoulders. One by one, the figures appeared closer to the fence with each camera switch, though no movement was ever recorded between frames. By the end of the sequence, they stood just yards from the site, their heads tilted unnaturally toward the lens. When the team returned the next morning, the ground showed no footprints in the snow. The footage was quickly confiscated by higher management and never released publicly. But several workers claimed to have seen it, and to this day they swear it was no trick of the camera. In 2011, a maintenance worker named Daniel Brooks disappeared from his station during a midnight shift. His coat and gloves were found neatly folded beside his post, his footprints leading away from the site, straight into the open tundra. The search lasted 2 weeks. Planes and snowmobiles covered every inch of the surrounding terrain, but no trace was ever found. Some believe Brooks became disoriented in the darkness, but others whisper he was taken by the Watchers. The men who knew him best said he'd been seeing things in the days before his disappearance. He complained of figures on the ridge that no one else could see. One co-worker recalled Daniel's final words to him, "They're waiting for me." I don't know why, but they are. Witnesses often describe an unnatural silence when the Watchers appear. Dogs stop barking. Machinery hums differently, as if muffled. Even the wind seems to die. The stillness presses on the ears, a weight that leaves men nauseous, dizzy, and afraid. One man described it as the world holding its breath. Another said it felt like standing underwater, every sound distant, distorted. When the Watchers vanish, the noise rushes back all at once. The engines, the wind, the crunch of boots on snow. But those who felt that silence never forget it. They say it lingers long after, creeping into dreams, where the Watchers wait just outside the glow of the mind. Of course, skeptics argue that the Watchers are nothing more than optical illusions. In the endless darkness of the North Slope, the brain invents shapes out of shadows. Mirage effects, ice fog, or distant machinery lights can all create the illusion of figures on the horizon. But this explanation doesn't account for the pointing gestures, the disappearing footprints, the consistent height and form described by dozens of unrelated witnesses. Nor does it explain why those who claim to see them often vanish themselves, whether into the tundra or into silence they cannot escape. In 2020, a group of contractors working on a winter road extension near Prudhoe Bay claimed they were watched for 3 nights in a row. On the first night, they saw a single figure standing far out on the ice, unmoving. The second night, there were 3. By the third night, there were 7, positioned in a perfect semicircle around the camp's lights. One contractor recorded audio during the final night. Though the men reported silence at the time, the playback revealed faint, rhythmic clicking noises, like stones tapping together. The clicks grew louder until suddenly the recording cut off. The men quit the project the next morning and flew home, refusing to ever return. Prudhoe Bay remains vital to Alaska's economy, a place of industry and survival at the top of the world. But those who work there long enough all have the same story, the sense of being watched, the silhouettes in the dark, the silence that falls without warning, whether they are spirits, remnants of an ancient people, or something alien to both man and earth. The Watchers are part of the North Slope's reality. They do not move often, they do not speak, but they are always there, patient and unblinking. And when the endless night swallows Prudhoe Bay, the floodlights seem to shrink, leaving more shadows than light. Shadows where the Watchers wait.